In the 17th century, a significant part of Ukraine was part of the Commonwealth. Polish was the official language on the territory of Ukraine, and Catholicism was the state religion. The increase in feudal obligations and religious oppression of Orthodox Ukrainians caused discontent with the Polish government. Hetman Bohdan Khmelnytskiy and the Zaporozhzhian army repeatedly pleaded Russia to take the poor little Russia under the High Royal Arm. So the Zemsky Sobor made a decision, and in June 1653, Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich announced his consent to the transition of Ukraine under the government of Russia. This is how these events are represented in Russian history, and this is exactly how these events are told in their school textbooks. However, the situation looked completely different from the perspective of Kiev. Since 1648, Ukraine had been waging an exhausting bloody war against one of the strongest states of Europe at the time, the Commonwealth. Hetman Bohdan Khmelnytskiy sought allies in almost every neighboring state, including the Moscow Empire. Only the Crimean Khan and the Moldovan Lord responded. Meanwhile, Moscow was waiting to see how the war would end. Only when the troops of Bohdan Khmelnytskiy besieged Lviv and began the campaign against Warsaw, the Tsar of Moscow began negotiations with Ukraine. In January 1654, after the decision of the Moscow Zemsky Sobor, the Great Cossack Rada assembled in Pereyaslav and confirmed the decision to accept the Moscow Tsar Protectorate. However, remembering the intrigue and arbitrariness of the Muscovites, Khmelnytskiy insisted on concluding a bilateral agreement that would spell out all the rights of the Zaporozhzhian army that the despotic Muscovy would try to cancel in any possible way. There is no true primary document regarding the Pereyaslav Rada, but that is exactly what the Russian Federation exploited to create myths for its people, as well as a good part of the Ukrainian population that was at the time still heavily influenced by Moscow and Bolshevik propaganda. We can freely say that the Ukrainian side did indeed recognize a certain power of the Tsar, but almost completely retained the rights of an independent state. In other words, the free elections of the Hetman and the Cossack officers remained the same. Their separate judicial, tax and financial systems also remained unchanged. The bilateral agreement between the Hetman state of Bohdan Khmelnytskiy and the Moscow Empire went down in history under the name of the Pereyaslav or March Articles. It is worth noting that the original document was not preserved to this day. The Ukrainian copy was stored in the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, but it was burned during a fire. As it turned out later, the fire was ignited by Moscow priests specifically to destroy Ukrainian religious and secular books that were undesirable for Moscow. According to Russians themselves, their copy disappeared under mysterious circumstances, even though it was the Russian Tsar who was most interested in the security of this document, since it was the only one that confirmed that the Ukrainian state really accepted the protectorate of Moscow. But if that's the case, then where were the Pereyaslav articles hidden? Or were they destroyed on purpose to conceal the true essence and meaning of the agreement? So what was in those articles? I think the answer here is obvious. It was a normal military agreement, an agreement on military cooperation between the Zaporozhzhian army and the Moscow Empire against the Commonwealth as a state that the Zaporozhzhian army had been waging war against at the time. Similar agreements, which were identical in my opinion, were signed with the Crimean Khanate in 1648, with the Kingdom of Sweden in 1657, and in addition to that the very same agreements were signed with the Principality of Moldova and others. All those agreements were the hallmark of foreign policy of Bohdan Khmelnytskiy, who adhered to the idea of polyvassalage. How did it work? Very simple. Let's say the Crimean Khanate was at war with the Moscow Empire. Bohdan Khmelnytskiy signed an alliance agreement with both states, and if the Moscow Empire would suddenly want to occupy the Ukrainian lands, the Crimean Khanate would immediately intervene and prevent the enemy from increasing their strength by capturing the Ukrainian lands. The Moscow Empire was to be the same counterbalance against the possible aggressive policy of the Crimean Khanate. Khmelnytskiy made similar agreements with the Principality of Moldavia, Transylvania, and even the Polish Commonwealth. It was a policy of balanced aggression at the borders of the Ukrainian Cossack state. The Pereyaslav Articles, although actually a more correct name would be the March Articles, were a typical political agreement. They were situational and temporary, and Bohdan Khmelnytskiy only had one use for it. Namely, to draw one more participant into the conflict in the east of Ukraine, Muscovy. In an attempt to escalate this conflict, he signed similar agreements with Sweden, Transylvania, and even with the Ottoman Empire. Therefore, the fact of signing an alliance with the Moscow Empire is seemingly a very ordinary event, and there was obviously no mention of any reunification of states, which were all simply late interpretations of the Russian leadership. According to the description of the March Articles by some Russian historians, particularly Alexei Yakovlev, it is quite clear that the Ukrainian state retained the right to elect the hetman and officials. Muscovy had no right to interfere in legal proceedings, taxes, and the economy of Ukraine in general. The hetman had the right to keep a large army subordinated only to him. According to this agreement, Muscovy was allowed to keep its garrison led by a voivode only in Kiev. In addition, the hetman's government was to coordinate the instructions assigned to the Ukrainian ambassadors in their foreign missions with the royal court. In other words, the Moscow Tsar only had a certain right to interfere with the hetman's foreign policy, but in no way influence the internal affairs and existence of Ukraine. Khmelnytskiy did not even consider joining Russia. When submitting the March Articles, he demanded that the Muscovites grant all the rights and liberties to the Zaporozhzhian army, as well as private ownership of land, which, by the way, did not even exist in the Moscow state. Then there also had to be a large army of 60,000 soldiers, and the taxes had to be collected in the hetman's treasury, not in the royal treasury. The first misunderstandings between the Ukrainian government and the Moscow delegation began at the Pereyaslav Rada itself and were civilizational in nature. The hetman and the Cossack officers gave an oath of allegiance to the signed agreements and demanded the same from the Moscow delegation. The reply of Voivode Buturlin was that the Tsar did not swear his oath of allegiance to his subjects. The Cossack officers realized that the Tsar of Moscow considered them his subjects and refused to take the oath. Khmelnytskiy tried to persuade them to take the oath with his authority, but some of the well-known and influential members of the officer ranks refused to take the oath. The clergy was also against it because they knew that Muscovy would not recognize the Ukrainian church books and that their orthodoxy was significantly different from the Constantinople canon that was used in Ukraine. Most of the Ukrainian clergy and Cossacks were against the Russification of Ukraine. This is why the Moscow Streltsy and forces loyal to the pro-Moscow Cossack elite forced people to take the oath to the Moscow Tsar. In other words, there was absolutely no brotherly unification at the time.
Отже, ніякого добровольного братського об'єднання на той час не було.
It did not happen later either, because the Muscovites began violating the alliance agreement immediately after signing it. Moscow garrisons appeared in the 5 largest cities of Ukraine, even though they should have only been present in Kiev. Moscow voivodes started violating the rights of free communities, the Cossacks and the commoners, treating them as powerless slaves. It was no surprise that later the Muscovites earned the reputation of occupants, especially since the Moscow Tsar signed the Truce of Andrusovo with the Poles behind the backs of Ukrainians. Moreover, he even divided the Ukrainian lands between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Muscovy. Poland would get the right bank and Muscovy would get the left bank of Ukraine.
Правобережну Україну, а за Московією відходили лівобережні українські землі.
Thus, it became quite obvious that the Pereyaslav articles lost all their power. That happened mainly because Muscovy violated the agreement by becoming allies with the enemy of the Ukrainian state, the Poles. Secondly, the separate agreement between Muscovy and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth led to the Cossack state Rada making a decision to establish a protectorate under the Ottoman Empire instead of Muscovy. The Korsun Agreement became the response to the Truce of Andrusovo, in which it was explicitly stated that we refused any treaties with the Moscow state and would pay tribute to the Ottoman Sultan, just like the lords of Wallachia and Moldavia. However, such a major reorientation of our country was preceded by several important events that clearly defined the attitude of the Moscow Kingdom to the allied agreement with Ukraine. First, after the death of the Hetman, the Muscovites declared that the Pereyaslav articles of Bohdan Khmelnytskiy had lost their validity, since, as they claimed, the Hetman signed a personal agreement with the Tsar, and since the Hetman had passed away, the agreement was no longer in effect. Therefore, the new Hetman had no choice but to enter into a new agreement with the Tsar. They immediately proposed a new agreement. As it turned out, the Muscovites significantly curtailed the autonomous rights of the Ukrainian state in the new agreement. Essentially, it would have led to the creation of Moscow voivode governors in the Ukrainian lands. Obviously, the Cossack officers refused to sign such an agreement with the Tsar. To commemorate the election of Yuri Khmelnytskiy, the young son of the deceased hetman, as the new hetman, the Cossack officers proposed their version of the new agreement to the Tsar of Moscow. It went down in history as the Zherdivsky Articles. Unfortunately, they remained in the drafting project stage, as the Moscow side categorically refused to approve them. Then the new hetman Yuri Khmelnytskiy entered into an alliance with the Ottoman Empire. However, during one of the combat encounters, he was captured by the Moscow Tsar. The latter forced him to sign the new alliance agreement on the terms of the Russian side. They started appointing their hetmans across the left bank territory, such as Akim Somko and others who were controlled by Moscow military leaders and essentially conducted military operations against the state center of the Ukrainian Cossack state in Chehirin. Such pro-Moscow separatist hetmans had special attributes of state power from the Moscow Tsar and acted on his behalf. Essentially, Muscovy and later Russia usurped power in Ukraine for 2.5 centuries. Liberation from Russian captivity came in the 20th century with the act of abdication of the last Russian Tsar Nicholas II.
Російського імператора Ніколая II.
With his abdication and the transition to a republican form of government in the Russian state, any oaths that the Ukrainian hetmans gave to the imperial Romanov dynasty were abolished.
Імператорській родині Романових.
But this is a topic for the next episode. In the meantime, remember that any phenomenon has its pros and cons, or its pro et contra.